Hi everyone, let's now turn our attention to the discussion of program design for aerobic exercise training. Now it's important to note that improvements in aerobic exercise performance can be derived only when sound principles are applied during training. To improve aerobic exercise performance, training programs must be designed to enhance the function of the respiratory, cardiovascular, as well as the muscular systems. Now most athletes as well as non-athletes would be better served by constructing their own training regimen based upon a good working knowledge of sound training principles as well as an understanding of their own physical limitations and needs. What successful aerobic endurance athletes have in common is a training program designed to enhance their strengths and improve their weaknesses. Now this module is going to include information about the factors related to aerobic exercise performance, the aerobic exercise training design variables, as well as various types of aerobic exercise training programs. Alright, so let's turn our attention first to factors related to aerobic exercise performance. Now when designing aerobic training programs, it is important to understand these factors that influence and thus play a significant role in successful aerobic exercise performance. This allows for the development of sound training programs while minimizing unnecessary training that may lead to fatigue, overwork, or overtraining. So this first factor related to aerobic exercise performance. No surprise, that's VO2 max, or maximal oxygen consumption. We've talked about this in a previous module, but with increasing exercise intensity or speed, we see this linear increase in VO2 or oxygen consumption up until our max is reached. And we know that with aerobic exercise training, that's effective to increase one's VO2 max. If we look at the literature here, in this study from 1983, they found a moderate to high correlation between VO2 max and performance in aerobic exercise events. Specifically in these 28 marathon runners, they found a moderate to high correlation between VO2 max and marathon time. So those with a higher VO2 max had a faster marathon time. Now if we look at this table from your textbook of VO2 max descriptive data for athletes in various sports, we see typical VO2 max values of athletes playing the sport. Again, this is in mLs per kg per minute for men as well as women. So in those that are classified as high to extremely high, those include athletes that play soccer, are involved in middle distance swimming, rowing, cycling, particularly elite cycling, long distance running, as well as cross-country skiing. So again, it's not important that you memorize these values here, but it should be apparent that the endurance individuals, those performing endurance type events, would be expected to have a higher VO2 max values compared to those performing less endurance type events. Now the second factor influencing aerobic exercise performance is lactate threshold. So with lactate threshold, this really corresponds to the exercise intensity that corresponds to a large increase in blood lactate levels. And in endurance events, the best competitor among athletes with similar VO2 max values is typically the person who can sustain aerobic energy production at the highest percentage of his or her VO2 max without accumulating large amounts of lactate within the muscle and within the blood. Now if we look at a lactate response curve here, again we're expressing blood lactate concentration over exercise intensity, and that's typically expressed as a percent of VO2 max or down on the bottom as treadmill speed. But what we see is that at a certain intensity, blood lactate starts to accumulate in the blood. And that's where we see this exponential increase in blood lactate concentration with increasing exercise intensity. So in the untrained subject in this example, we see that the lactate threshold is occurring around between 50 to 60% of VO2 max, whereas in the trained person it's occurring about 80% of that person's VO2 max. And if we look at it in terms of treadmill speed, in the untrained person, their lactate threshold, this alinear or exponential increase in blood lactate concentration is occurring around a speed of 8 kilometers per hour, whereas in the trained person, just under 12 kilometers per hour. Now, there's been a number of studies published over the years supporting that lactate threshold may be a better indicator of aerobic exercise performance compared to VO2 max. This study, which was published in 1988 in 14 competitive cyclists, they all had a high VO2 max value. On average, their VO2 max was 67 mLs per kg per minute. And if you go back to the previous slide, that corresponds to that kind of very high category. So in this study, they had these cyclists basically perform a time to fatigue test. And that time to fatigue occurred during exercise at 88% of their VO2 max, so very high intensity. And then they measured their blood lactate concentration at various intensities or percentages of that VO2 max. So what they found, they really found two groups of cyclists here. They found this low lactate threshold group that performed on average 29 minutes of high intensity exercise with their average percent VO2 max or average lactate threshold occurring around 65% of their VO2 max. And they also had a separate group of also trained cyclists that had a high lactate threshold. They performed on average 61 minutes of high intensity of exercise, and their average lactate threshold occurred at about 80 to 82% of their VO2 max. So overall, they concluded here that time to fatigue during high intensity cycling exercise was more than twofold longer in the cyclist with a high lactate threshold compared to the same cyclist with a low lactate threshold. And as we'll see later, improving one's lactate threshold requires some training at elevated blood levels of lactate. And we'll talk about specific aerobic exercise training types later on in this module. Another factor affecting aerobic exercise performance is exercise economy. And that is simply the oxygen cost of exercise at a given intensity of exercise. So looking at this graph, we'll come back to this in a little bit. We're plotting oxygen uptake, again, mLs per kg per minute, at different speeds of running or different intensities of exercise. And what we know is that having a lower VO2 or a lower oxygen uptake at the same intensity indicates better exercise economy. In other words, we can say the person with a lower VO2 at the same intensity is more economical. We also know that athletes with a high exercise economy expend less energy during exercise to maintain a given exercise intensity. So looking at the figure here, we have runner A and runner B. They have equal VO2 max values. Their VO2 max is 75 mLs per kg per minute for both runner A and runner B. But looking at the data points here, the figure, which runner is more economical? So by looking at the data again, we know that exercise economy is simply the oxygen cost of exercise at a given exercise intensity. So for each level of exercise intensity that you see down here, plotted as running speed, runner B is basically consuming less oxygen or less energy to run at that given speed compared to runner A. So therefore we could say that runner B was more economical or had a higher exercise economy. Now if we go back and look at some of the primary literature, this study published back in 1980 found a high positive correlation between steady state VO2 at 3 different running speeds and 10-kilometer race performance in trained distance runners. And that's typically how we assess a person's exercise or running economy, is having them run on a treadmill or exercise on some other modality for several minutes of duration at a specific intensity in order to determine their steady state oxygen consumption. So let's talk now about some factors that have been shown to affect one's exercise economy. So let's talk about running, cycling, and swimming as our examples. So for running, both stride length and stride frequency have been shown to affect exercise economy, with those that have a shorter stride length and a greater stride frequency having better exercise economy. With cycling, both body mass as well as aerodynamics influence exercise economy. So a person who has a heavier body mass, improper body position on the bike, which is going to increase drag or resistance, therefore affecting aerodynamics, that's going to overall result in a decrease in exercise economy. And then finally, with swimming, by improving one's swimming technique, which comes with experience, that's been shown also to improve exercise economy during swimming. All right, before we get into the specifics of aerobic exercise program design, really the first step here is to perform what is known as a needs analysis. And we'll do the same thing when we discuss resistance training program design in the upcoming weeks. So the first stage of performing a needs analysis is to evaluate the requirements and characteristics of the sport. So this includes performing what is known as a movement analysis, where you're analyzing or describing the body and limb movement patterns as well as the muscles involved in those movements. Performing next a physiological analysis. So basically determining what are the requirements for performing well in that particular sport or event. Is it going to be a high aerobic capacity, high level speed, strength, power, hypertrophy, or so on? Or is it going to be a combination of many parameters of athletic performance that result in successful performance in that particular sport or event? We also have to consider injury here as part of this stage one of the needs analysis. So what are some common injury sites based upon the sport or the athlete? And then the second stage of the needs analysis, assessing the athlete's needs and goals. So the first part of this stage two is evaluating the athlete's training as well as injury status. You can break that down into what type of current training program, if any, are they performing? What is the length of recent regular participation and the intensity level of that exercise of any previous training programs, and their degree of exercise technique experience. So most athletes have been doing this particular sport or event for years, therefore have a high degree of exercise technique experience, also known as a high training status. The second part of this stage two is to conduct physical testing and evaluate the results, something we talked about in the previous module regarding the test of athletic performance. But again, we know that these tests should relate to the athlete's sport, be consistent with the athlete's skill level, as well as based upon the equipment available. Next, we want to use the results of the movement analysis to select specific and appropriate test. And finally, compare results with normative or descriptive data to determine the athlete's strengths as well as his or her weaknesses. And then the final step of this needs analysis is determining the primary training goal. So in terms of aerobic exercise, is it to improve or maintain one's VO2 max, lactate threshold, or exercise economy? Now, it may be attractive to focus on improving all three with one training program, but again, important here to acknowledge that an effort should be made to concentrate on one training outcome per sport season.